Before the chaos, a world of 1,000 measures, imagine you are standing in a market in Paris. The year is 1785, it is early morning, and the city is already awake, the kind of waking that happens before the light is fully ready. When the sky is still the color of ash and the cobblestones are slick with last night's rain. Around you, the market is assembling itself. Carts are being unloaded. Cheese wheels are stacked. Sacks of flour are dragged across the stones with a sound like slow breathing. And everywhere, there is the noise of argument. You are a linen merchant. You have been one for 11 years. Your mother was one before you, and her mother before her. You know the cloth trade the way you know your own hands, every weave, every thread count, every subtle difference between a good bolt and a poor one. What you do not know, and what has never been fully settled in all your years of trading, is exactly how much cloth you are supposed to be selling when a customer asks for an own. An own is a unit of length, or rather, it is supposed to be. In Paris, an own is roughly 1.18 meters. Not that you would say it that way, because the meter does not exist yet, not for another decade. In Lyon, an own is different. In Rouen, it is different again. If you were to travel south to Marseille and try to sell your linen using the Paris own as your measure, you would find yourself in a very confusing negotiation very quickly. And if a buyer from Bordeaux comes to your stall today, which one does? Most Tuesdays, you will spend a portion of your morning not discussing price or quality, but simply trying to agree on what a measurement means. This is not a small inconvenience. This is the texture of daily life in pre-revolutionary France. Before 1789, before the revolution swept through and tried to remake the world, France was not really one country in any practical sense. It was a patchwork, a mosaic of provinces, each with its own history, its own customs, its own loyalties, and its own weights and measures. Historians who have studied this period estimate that France had somewhere between 700 and 800 different units of measurement in use simultaneously. 700 to 800. The word for foot, pied, existed everywhere. But the length of a pied in Paris was not the same as in Provence, not the same as in Brittany, not the same as in Alsace. Each region had inherited its measurements from centuries of local lords, local guilds, local traditions that had calcified into habit and then into law. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what it means to try to buy grain. You are a farmer in Burgundy. You have grown wheat this year, good weather, a harvest you are proud of. You bring it to market in sacks. The unit you sell by is called a bushel. But the boisseau in your village is not the same as the boisseau in the next town. It is not the same as the boisseau used by the merchant who comes from the city to buy. He knows this. You know this too. And the gap between those two boisseaux, the space of ambiguity between your measure and his, is where he makes a portion of his profit, not through outright theft, not necessarily through conscious dishonesty, simply through the fact that in a world without agreed standards, those with more power, more education, more access to the courts tend to win arguments about measurement, and those without those things tend to lose them. The peasants and small farmers and market traders of pre-revolutionary France were not naive. They knew they were being cheated. The complexity of the measurement system was not an accident of history that nobody had noticed. It was, in many ways, a feature rather than a bug, a deliberate, or at least deliberately maintained confusion that kept power exactly where it was. A landlord collecting dues in grain could use a large measure when collecting and a small measure when paying out. A merchant buying wool could use a generous unit for purchasing and a strict one for selling. The variation in measurements was not equally distributed. It tended, with a kind of grinding consistency, to favor those who already had the advantage. There were weights, too, not just lengths. The livre, the pound, existed as a unit of weight across France, but its actual mass varied by region and by commodity. There was one livre for gold, a different one for general commerce, a different one again for certain specific trades. The toise was a unit of distance used by surveyors and architects, but again, the Paris toise and the regional variations could differ enough to cause real confusion in any large construction project. For those trying to navigate trade across provincial borders, the measurement problem was not a background annoyance. It was a central, daily, exhausting challenge that consumed time, created disputes, and routinely ended in someone being shortchanged, and the shortchanged were almost always the same people. Not the merchants with lawyers, not the nobles with their estates and their clerks and their ability to argue in court. The people who bore the weight of measurement chaos, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand as we begin this story, were the ordinary people, the farmers, the weavers, the bakers, the women at market stalls, the small traders trying to move goods from one end of the country to the other. They were the ones for whom an inconsistent own meant actual material loss. They were the ones for whom a dishonest boiseau was the difference between a year that worked and a year that didn't, single quotes. So when you stand in that Paris market in 1785, holding your bolt of linen, arguing with the man from Bordeaux about what an own means, you are not just having a trade dispute. You are standing inside one of the deep structural unfairnesses of the old world. You are living in your hands and in your frustration and in the particular tightness around your jaw as you try to keep your voice level. The accumulated weight of centuries of unequal rules, the Enlightenment philosophers, sitting in their warm studies, writing their treatises, had noticed this too, of course. They had noticed it and given it a name and decided it needed to change. But we will come to them in a moment. First, stay here a little longer. Stay in this market. Feel the rain-damp cold of the morning, the smell of fresh bread from the baker to stalls down, the sound of haggling in a dozen different accents. This is the world that the metric system was born to fix. This is the world it was trying to leave behind. And the thing is, even if you could not yet imagine the world that was coming, even if the revolution and the surveyors and the Meridian expedition and all the rest of it were still years away, you would have felt, standing there with your linen and your contested measurements, a very deep and familiar tiredness. The tiredness of a system that made everything harder than it needed to be. The tiredness of knowing the rules were not made for people like you. The tiredness of having to fight for every fair transaction in a country where the very tools of fairness, the measures themselves, were riddled with advantage. That tiredness, more than any philosopher's dream, is where the metric system really began. Not in the academies, not in the treatises, but in the markets and the granaries and the weaving rooms and the farmyards of a country that had simply grown exhausted by inequality measured in every possible unit. The philosopher's dream, enlightenment, and the idea of universal measure, long before the revolution, changed everything. There were men and a handful of remarkable women sitting in the candlelit rooms of Paris and writing about the future. They called themselves philosophers, though today we might call them something like public intellectuals, or reformers, or simply dreamers with very good arguments. They wrote about reason. They wrote about rights. They wrote about the possibility of a world organized not around the accident of birth and the inherited privilege of kings and nobles, but around the clean, universal logic of nature itself. And some of them, the ones whose dreams were most practical, most rooted in the specific texture of daily life, wrote about measurement. The idea of a universal system of weights and measures did not begin with the French Revolution. It had been circulating for well over a century before the storming of the Bastille. As early as 1670, a French clergyman named Gabriel Mouton had proposed a system of measurement based on the arc of the earth, something tied to the natural world rather than to the arbitrary length of some long-dead king's foot or forearm. The idea was elegant and radical at once. If you based your units on the planet itself, on something that existed independently of any human power or tradition, you would have a system that was truly universal. It would belong to everyone, everywhere. No nation could claim it as their own. No king could alter it by decree. It would simply be true in the way that mathematics is true. This was a very Enlightenment idea. The intellectual movement that flourished across Europe through the 17th and 18th centuries was, at its heart, a love affair with reason. The philosophers of the Enlightenment believed with a passion that could tip into arrogance, but was also genuinely beautiful, that the human mind, applied carefully and honestly to the world, could understand it, could improve it, could strip away the accumulated superstitions and inherited injustices and irrational traditions, and reveal underneath them a set of clear, logical principles on which a better society could be built. Measurement was not a romantic cause. It did not have the soaring emotional appeal of liberty or the moral urgency of the argument against slavery. But the Enlightenment thinkers who turned their attention to it understood that it was deeply, practically connected to those larger causes. Condorcet, the mathematician and philosopher, who would become one of the most important voices for the metric system, saw the reform of weights and measures as inseparable from the reform of society itself. A chaotic, inconsistent system of measurement was a tool of oppression. Standardize it, make it rational and universal, and you removed one of the most reliable mechanisms by which the powerful cheated the powerless. You gave ordinary people a fighting chance. And it is worth pausing on him for a moment, because his story threads through the history of the metric system in ways that are both inspiring and deeply sad. He was a child prodigy, a mathematician of real brilliance, and a man who held to his principles with a kind of stubborn courage that the coming revolution would test to destruction. He believed in universal education. He believed in women's rights, genuinely believed, at a time when almost no one did, that women deserved the full rights of citizens. He believed in the abolition of slavery, and he believed that a rational system of weights and measures, adopted universally, could be a small but real step toward a more just world. When the Académie des Sciences d'Alp, the great institution of French scientific life, founded a century earlier under Louis XIV, began to seriously engage with the question of measurement reform in the 1780s. Condorcet was at the center of those discussions. So was the astronomer Lalande and the chemist Lavoisier, and a constellation of other brilliant, idealistic men who saw in the measurement problem both an intellectual puzzle worth solving and a moral cause worth championing. The discussions were theoretical at first, philosophical even. What should the basis of a universal unit be? Some argued for the length of a pendulum that beats once per second, which is a consistent length across the Earth. Others argued for a fraction of the Earth's own circumference, which had the advantage of being even more directly tied to nature itself. The pendulum idea was appealing in its simplicity. You could, in principle, determine the standard length anywhere in the world, as long as you had a pendulum and could count its swings. But there was a complication. The length of a second's pendulum varies slightly depending on where on Earth you measure it, because the Earth is not a perfect sphere and gravity is not perfectly uniform. The philosophers found this unsatisfying. They wanted something more absolute. The Earth's circumference had a different appeal. If you defined your unit of length as a fraction of the distance from the pole to the equator, 1/10,000,000th, say, of that arc, then you had something that was truly planetary in scale, something that spoke to the whole globe, to every human being on it, regardless of nation or language or tradition. The fact that actually measuring this arc would require a colossal scientific expedition did not dampen the enthusiasm. If anything, the scale of the challenge added to its appeal. This was Enlightenment thinking at its most ambitious. Let us measure the Earth itself, and from that measurement build a fairer world. What strikes you, reading about these discussions now, is how much hope was bundled into what might seem like a dry, technical question. These men were not simply arguing about units. They were arguing about the possibility of human progress. They were saying, look, the world is full of injustice and confusion and inherited privilege, but none of that is inevitable. We can think our way to something better. We can build systems, not just of government, not just of law, but of the very basic infrastructure of daily life that are rational, fair, and universal. A meter for the market woman in Paris, a meter for the merchant in London, a meter for the scientist in Philadelphia, the same meter everywhere, forever. It is a beautiful dream, and like many beautiful dreams, it was going to meet the real world with a significant bump, because the real world, as the philosophers were about to discover, is not populated entirely by rational actors who welcome logical improvements. The real world is populated by people with habits and memories and emotional attachments to the familiar. The real world is populated by farmers who have measured their fields in units their grandfathers used, and market women who know their measures by feel and by sight, and tradespeople whose livelihoods depend on a system they understand, however imperfect. The real world, in other words, was going to have some opinions about being remeasured, but that is getting ahead of our story. For now, stay in the warm candlelight of the philosopher's study. Feel the excitement of it, the genuine, infectious excitement of people who believe they are working out the shape of a better world. There is something wonderful about that faith. even knowing, as we do, that the road ahead was going to be so much harder than anyone imagined. The dream of a universal measure, a meter for all humanity, was one of the loveliest things the Enlightenment produced, and it deserves a moment of quiet appreciation before the revolution arrives and makes everything complicated. If you've ever felt the absurdity of two countries separated by an invisible border using completely different units for the same things, if you've ever converted miles to kilometers on a road trip, tried to follow a recipe that mixes grams and ounces, then you already understand in your bones what these philosophers were trying to fix. You are their inheritor, for better or worse. The world you live in, measured mostly in meters and kilograms and liters, is the world they dreamed of. It just took a very long time and a great deal of difficulty to get there. Revolution arrives. The political urgency of reform. In the spring of 1789, France did something extraordinary. It sat down and wrote itself a letter. The letter, or rather, the tens of thousands of letters, were called the Cahiers de doléances, grievance notebooks. The king, Louis XVI, facing a financial crisis so severe it threatened to bring the entire kingdom to its knees, had called the Estates General, a kind of parliamentary assembly that had not met in 175 years. And as part of the preparation for this meeting, he asked the people of France to write down their complaints. Every parish, every guild, every community across the country was invited to list what was wrong with their world, what needed to change, what they had suffered, what they wanted. The results were extraordinary, not just for what they contained, though they contained everything, from the brutal to the mundane, but for what they revealed about how ordinary people experienced the structures of their world. There were grievances about serfdom, about noble privilege, about the crushing weight of taxes. There were grievances about legal inequality, about the arbitrary power of local lords, about the impossibility of getting justice when the justice system itself was stacked against you. And there were grievances about weights and measures. Dozens and dozens and dozens of them, town after town, village after village, wrote about the inconsistency of measurement as one of the concrete daily mechanisms of their oppression. They described how landlords used oversized measures when collecting rent in grain, and undersized ones when distributing anything in return. They wrote about market frauds, about the impossibility of trading fairly across regional borders, about the way the confusion of the system was exploited by those with the knowledge and the power to navigate it, and used against those without. Reading the Cahiers today, you feel the weight of ordinary frustration transmuted into political energy. These were not abstract philosophical arguments. These were specific, lived experiences. The woman who wrote about the grain measure her landlord used, the small merchant who described losing money on every transaction that crossed a provincial border because the units shifted under him, the farmer who had spent years trying to understand why the measure for tax collection always seemed to be slightly larger than the measure for anything else. This was the fuel, the very human, very concrete fuel that was about to set the world on fire. The revolution broke in the summer of 1789 with a speed and violence that shocked even those who had seen it coming. The Bastille fell. The old order cracked. The National Assembly, suddenly finding itself the effective government of France, was confronted with an almost incomprehensible task: remake everything. The legal system, the tax system, the church, the government, the relationship between citizen and state, between individual and community, between France and the idea of France. And among all of these enormous, terrifying, exhilarating tasks, the weights and measures, in 1790, the National Assembly formally requested that the Académie des Sciences take on the project of designing a new, rational, universal system of weights and measures. The political moment had caught up with the philosophical dream. Condorcet, now one of the most important intellectual voices in the revolution, was deeply involved. So was Talleyrand, the slippery, brilliant politician who had proposed measurement reform to the Assembly in the early days. There was even a brief, tantalizing moment when it seemed possible that France and Britain might cooperate on a shared universal standard. Talleyrand had corresponded with members of the British Parliament about it, and there had been interest from the United States too, where Thomas Jefferson was deeply engaged with the question of measurement reform. Imagine that parallel world for a moment, a world where France, Britain, and the United States, in the revolutionary year of 1790, when all three nations were charged with the electricity of transformation, had agreed together on a single, rational system of measurement, where the English-speaking world and the French-speaking world had built, from the beginning, the same infrastructure of daily life. The metric system and the imperial system would never have had to compete. The confusion that has persisted for 2 centuries, the stubbornness of feet, miles, and ounces in countries that otherwise trade in an increasingly metricated world, might never have happened. It didn't work out that way. The political moment passed, Britain retreated, the window closed. But the possibility had existed, and it is worth noting because it tells us that the reform was not simply a French nationalist project. It was, at its best, a genuinely universal aspiration, rooted in the Enlightenment belief that reason belonged to everyone. The committee that the ACI assembled to design the new system was remarkable. Lagrange, one of the greatest mathematicians of the century; Laplace, the man who would transform our understanding of the solar system; Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, a man who also happened to be a tax farmer for the old regime, which would become a fatal complication in a few years; Monge, Borda, Condorcet himself. These were not minor figures. They were the scientific elite of one of the most scientifically advanced nations in the world, tasked with a project that was simultaneously practical and utopian, to measure the Earth, and from that measurement, build a fairer world. The debates within the committee were serious and sometimes fierce. The pendulum versus the meridian. The question of which fraction of the Earth's arc to use. The question of whether the new units should be decimally based, divided into tens, hundreds, thousands, which seemed obviously rational to the mathematicians, or whether some other system might be more practical for daily use. The decimal argument won, and this was actually one of the most consequential decisions in the history of measurement. A decimal system meant that converting between units, from meters to centimeters, from kilograms to grams, required only moving a decimal point. No more 12 inches in a foot, 16 ounces in a pound, 5,280 feet in a mile. Just tens and hundreds and thousands, clean and simple and endlessly scalable. The revolutionary government swept up in its own rational fervor, extended the decimal logic even further. There was briefly a decimal calendar, 10 days in a week, 10 hours in a day. There were decimal clocks. The revolution, in its most utopian phase, wanted to remake not just measurement, but time itself. Most of these experiments did not survive contact with human reality. The decimal clock is gone. The revolutionary calendar lasted about 12 years before Napoleon quietly retired it. But the metric system that one endured, that one turned out to be right. The decision was made. The meter would be defined as 1/10,000,000th of the arc of the Earth's meridian from the North Pole to the equator. It was an elegant, philosophical, almost impossibly ambitious definition. And it meant that before the meter could exist as a physical reality, before a standard bar could be made, before anyone could actually use it, someone had to go and measure the Earth. Someone had to go out into a France that was tearing itself apart, carrying delicate instruments through war and suspicion and political chaos, and take the measure of the world. The Meridian expedition, 2 men, a broken country, and the birth of the meter in June of 1792. 2 men set out in opposite directions. Jean-Baptiste Delambre headed north from Paris toward Dunkirk. Pierre Méchain headed south toward Barcelona. Between them, they intended to measure the arc of the Earth's meridian, the imaginary line running through Paris, connecting the North Pole to the equator. They would use a technique called triangulation, moving from hilltop to hilltop, from church tower to church tower, measuring the angles between known points with extraordinary precision. From these measurements, they would calculate the exact length of the meridian arc between Dunkirk and Barcelona. And from that, by mathematics, they would derive the length of 1/10,000,000th of the full arc from pole to equator. That length would be the meter. It was, on paper, a clear plan. It was, in practice, an adventure of almost comic difficulty. Delambre, methodical man with the patience of someone who has spent his career staring at stars, set off northward with his team, his instruments, and his letters of authorization. The letters were supposed to explain what he was doing, why he was climbing church towers and placing reflecting targets on hilltops and making measurements with a device called a repeating circle that looked, to anyone not familiar with astronomical instruments, deeply suspicious. France, in the summer of 1792, was a country on the edge. The revolution had turned radical. There were émigré armies massing at the borders. There were spies everywhere, or rather, there was the fear of spies everywhere, which amounts to much the same thing in terms of the welcome you receive when you arrive in a small village carrying strange equipment and asking to climb the church tower. Delambre was arrested, not once, but multiple times. Each time, his letters of authorization, signed by the Academy, countersigned by the government, would eventually convince the local authorities that he was a scientist, not a spy. But the letters required explaining, the explanations required time, and time was something the expedition had very little of. He pressed on. He was methodical, patient, and remarkably difficult to discourage. When church towers were demolished, the revolution, in its anti-clerical fury, had a habit of demolishing church towers. He improvised. He built wooden scaffolding. He climbed hilltops. He found whatever high point he could and took his measurements in the south. Méchain was having a different kind of difficulty. He had crossed into Spain, where the political situation was, if anything, more complicated. Spain and France were not yet at war, but the relationship was uneasy, and Méchain was a French scientist in a foreign country. During a revolution, trying to take astronomical measurements that could, to the uninformed observer, look very much like military surveying, he managed, largely through charm and the universal language of scientific reputation, to negotiate his way through most of it. He set up his instruments. He made his measurements. He worked with the careful, obsessive precision that was his defining quality. And then, in the spring of 1793, he had an accident. A water pump he was examining, a piece of machinery he was looking at out of simple scientific curiosity, nothing to do with the expedition, suddenly engaged while he was too close to it. He was thrown. The injuries were serious: broken ribs, a damaged shoulder, months of recovery. When he finally returned to his work, something had changed. His measurements in the region around Barcelona were not matching up the way they should. There was a small but troubling discrepancy, a few seconds of arc, a tiny but persistent error that he could not account for and could not make disappear. Most scientists, encountering such a discrepancy, would have reported it honestly, noted the probable causes: atmospheric refraction, instrument error, the inherent difficulty of measuring a curve from a flat surface, and moved on. The discrepancy was small enough to fall within acceptable margins of error. It would not have materially affected the final result. Méchain did not report it. He could not. Something in him, some deep perfectionism, some horror of being seen to have made an error, some private standard of precision that refused to accept any gap between what was measured and what was true, would not let him report a result he was not certain of. He kept the discrepancy secret. He told himself he would remeasure. He would find the source of the error. He would fix it before anyone knew. He did not fix it. But we will return to Méchain, and to his secret, and to what it cost him, because that story deserves its own space. For now, we follow the expedition forward through time, because the world was not waiting for Méchain to find his peace. Back in Paris, the revolution was consuming itself. The reign of terror had arrived. Lavoisier, the great chemist, the man who had sat on the original measurement committee, was guillotined in 1794. Condorcet, the philosopher who had perhaps done more than anyone to translate the dream of a universal measure into a political reality, was arrested. He died in his cell, probably by his own hand. In March 1794, the Académie des Sciences itself was abolished, its members scattered, or worse. The institutional framework that had commissioned the expedition was dismantling itself in real time. Delambre and Méchain continued working. There is something almost surreal about this, to scientists, slowly and painstakingly measuring the Earth, while the revolution ground through its most violent phase around them. Delambre worked in the north, moving between observation points, calculating and recalculating. Méchain worked in the south, or tried to. He was trapped in Spain when war finally broke out between France and Spain in 1793, cut off from home, unable to proceed and unable to return. He spent months in Barcelona, in a kind of suspended scientific exile, obsessively remeasuring his stations, unable to let go of the discrepancy that haunted him. They did not complete their measurements until 1798, 6 years after setting out. 6 years of revolution and terror and war and imprisonment and accident and scientific obsession. When they finally brought their results back to Paris, where the political situation had stabilized somewhat under the Directory, that deeply imperfect government that held France together between the Terror and Napoleon, a commission of European scientists was assembled to review the data and calculate the final value of the meter. The commission was itself remarkable. French and foreign scientists working together in the spirit of universal knowledge that the original project had embodied. They examined the measurements, made their calculations, and produced a result. The meter was defined. A physical platinum bar was made to that exact length. The kilogram was defined as the mass of a cubic decimeter of water at its densest temperature, and a standard kilogram weight was made to match. These two objects, the meter bar and the kilogram, became the physical embodiment of the new system, standards, archetypes, the anchors of a rational world. The meter bar is still in existence. Though it is no longer the definition of the meter, science has moved beyond it, and we will come to that. It sits in a vault, this modest platinum bar, carrying in its precise length the accumulated work of two men who walked through a revolution with instruments and dreams, measuring the world so that the world might someday measure itself fairly. The people resist. Why ordinary French citizens rejected the metric system here is something that the history books sometimes skip over, or mention only in passing, because it complicates the clean narrative of rational progress. The French people, the ordinary men and women for whom the metric system was supposedly designed, largely refused to use it. For decades, for a very long time, the metric system was officially introduced in France in 1795 and made legally mandatory in 1799 by decree. By law, the old measures were abolished. The new ones were required, and the reaction across most of France was somewhere between bafflement and outright resistance. To understand why, you have to understand something about measurement that the philosophers, for all their brilliance, had perhaps slightly underestimated. Measurement is not just a technical system, it is a cultural one. It is embedded in language, in memory, in the physical habits of the body. When a carpenter measures a plank, he is not performing an abstract mathematical operation. He is using a unit that he learned from his father, that his father learned from his father, that has been present in the workshop and the field and the market for as long as anyone can remember. The unit feels real in a way that a purely rational invention cannot quite feel real. It is tied to the world through time and habit and the particular warmth of the familiar. The new metric units had none of this. The meter was a philosophical abstraction, 1/10,000,000th of the Earth's meridian arc, derived from a 6-year scientific expedition that most ordinary French people had never heard of. The kilogram was the mass of a cubic decimeter of water at 4 degrees Celsius, which is a sentence that means very little to someone who has spent their life measuring flour by the lever. These were not human units. They were not the foot that is roughly the length of a human foot, or the ell that is roughly the span of the arm. They were units defined by the universe, which is magnificent in theory and somewhat alienating in practice. There was also, for many French people, a political dimension to the resistance. The metric system came from Paris. It came from the academy, from the intellectuals, from the very elite that many in the provinces regarded with deep ambiguity, even as they had cheered the fall of the old aristocracy. One kind of authority had been replaced, it sometimes felt, by another kind, the authority of reason, of science, of the educated man who knew better than you about everything, including what you should call the distance from your house to the market. The old measures, for all their chaos, were local. They belonged to the village, to the region, to the community. The new ones came from outside, from above, from the same Parisian world that had always looked down at the provinces. In markets across France, people continued to use the old units, not in defiance, exactly, more simply because that is what everyone understood. A customer asking for a lever of butter was not making a political statement. She was asking for the amount of butter she had always bought in the unit she and the seller both knew without thinking. The new units required thinking. They required conversion. They required a mental adjustment that nobody had really asked for and that carried no immediate benefit in daily life. You got the same amount of butter either way. Why learn a new word for it? The legal enforcement of the metric system proved essentially impossible. France did not have the administrative infrastructure to police measurement at the level of individual market transactions. Inspectors could not be everywhere, and even when they were, the cultural resistance was powerful enough that violations were widespread and largely tolerated. Communities developed a kind of quiet, collective decision to ignore the new rules, at least in day-to-day life. The old names persisted in conversation, even when the official records used metric units. Napoleon, who took power in 1799, had a complicated relationship with the metric system. He was not unsympathetic to it. He was, in many ways, the great consolidator of revolutionary reforms, the man who took the chaos of the revolution and hammered it into lasting institutions. But he was also a pragmatist, and he could see that the metric system was generating significant popular resistance. In 1812, he issued a decree that reintroduced a set of traditional units, the mesures usuelles, or customary measures that were defined in terms of metric values but had names drawn from the old system. So the pied, the old foot, came back, redefined as exactly 1/3 of a meter. The lever came back, redefined as 500 grams. This compromise allowed the old familiar names to coexist with the metric underpinning. At least for commercial purposes, it was, in its way, an admission that the gap between what is rational and what is livable cannot always be closed by decree. The metric system was right. It was rational. It was, by any objective measure, a better system than what it replaced. And yet people did not want it. Because people are not primarily rational actors when it comes to the familiar textures of their daily lives. They are emotional, habitual, community-shaped creatures. And measurement, like language, like food, like the particular way your grandmother held her hands when she prayed, is one of the things that locates you in your world. The mesures usuelles persisted until 1840. When France finally, firmly, definitively committed to the metric system and prohibited the old names entirely. By that point, a full generation had grown up learning metric units in school. The old resistance was thinning. The younger people for whom the meter was simply the unit they had always learned did not feel the same attachment to the pied and the toys and the boisseau. The battle was not won by force. It was won by time and by education, and by the slow replacement of one generation's habits with another's. It is a reminder of something important. something that goes beyond the history of measurement. The most rational reform in the world will fail if it is imposed without understanding the human cost of abandoning the familiar. Change happens not when it is decreed, but when it is absorbed, not when it is logical, but when it is lived. The metric system did not triumph because France decided to be rational. It triumphed because, eventually, France grew into it. Méchain's secret, obsession, error, and the weight of perfection. Pierre Méchain is not as famous as he should be. In the history of the metric system, Delumbre tends to get the larger share of the attention, partly because he wrote a comprehensive account of the expedition, partly because his side of the story was more immediately dramatic. All those arrests and demolished church towers and improvised scaffolding. Méchain's story is quieter, more interior, and in some ways much sadder. It is the story of a man who set an impossible standard for himself and spent the rest of his life unable to meet it. Méchain was, by all accounts, an extraordinary scientist. He had a gift for precision, a genuine, almost physical sensitivity to error, a deep discomfort with approximation, a belief that science meant getting things exactly right, not approximately right, not right within acceptable margins. He had discovered comets. He was a respected member of the scientific community, a man whose measurements were trusted, and it was precisely this reputation, this standard, that made the Barcelona discrepancy so unbearable, the error. And here we should be clear that it was very small. A few seconds of arc in his measurements of the latitude of the Barcelona Observatory had a probably mundane explanation. Atmospheric refraction, the way light bends as it passes through air of varying density and temperature, can introduce small, systematic errors into astronomical measurements, especially near sea level. It is a known issue. It is not a sign of incompetence. Méchain, measuring at an observatory essentially at sea level in the warm coastal air of Barcelona, may simply have encountered an atmospheric effect that skewed his results in a way that was perfectly explicable and not, ultimately, all that significant. But Méchain did not know this for certain. He suspected it, but he could not prove it, and the not knowing was, for him, the same as the error itself. He could not submit results he was uncertain of. He could not put his name to measurements that might contain a flaw he had not yet identified and corrected. He was a scientist, and scientists, as he understood science, did not do that, so he kept quiet. He told no one about the discrepancy. He submitted his measurements for the other stations in his survey, the ones he was confident in, and said nothing about Barcelona. He told himself he would return, remeasure, find the source of the problem, and correct it. The expedition ended. The meter was defined. The standard bar was made. Méchain went back to his regular work, now a celebrated figure, one of the men who had measured the earth, and he could not let it go. The discrepancy lived in him. It was a small thing, objectively, smaller than most people working on the project would have found troubling. But for Méchain, it was enormous, because it was his. He knew about it, and he had not told anyone. And every year that passed without correction was a year in which the metric system sat on a foundation that he knew was, in some small way, impure. He attempted to return to Barcelona. The war between France and Spain made this difficult. He tried other approaches, other measurements, looking for a way to reconcile his conflicting data. Nothing satisfied him. The numbers would not resolve. He grew obsessed, then consumed. His health, already fragile from the accident with the water pump, suffered. He became withdrawn, difficult to work with, unable to take pleasure in his considerable scientific achievements. In 1804, Méchain was appointed director of the Paris Observatory, the highest honor French astronomy could offer. It should have been the culmination of his career. Instead, he almost immediately began planning another expedition. He would extend the Meridian survey further south, past Barcelona, into Spain, and toward the Balearic Islands. He would remeasure. He would find the discrepancy's source. He would fix it. He went to Spain in 1806. He was not in good health. The conditions were difficult. There were logistical problems, political complications, the ordinary grinding difficulties of a major scientific expedition. And in Castellón de la Plana, in September 1806, Méchain contracted yellow fever. He died there, in Spain, 14 years after setting out on the expedition that had defined his life, and, in some private chamber of his being, destroyed his peace. He never told anyone about the discrepancy. He took the secret to his grave. It was Delumbra who eventually discovered it. After Méchain's death, going through the papers his colleague had left behind, Delumbra found the evidence, the original observations, the alternative calculations, the gap that Méchain had spent 14 years trying to close. Delumbra understood immediately what had happened, and he faced a choice: expose the error, which might undermine public confidence in the metric system, or absorb it into the larger dataset, where, frankly, it was small enough to be lost. He chose transparency. He published everything, including an honest discussion of the discrepancy and its probable causes. And his analysis confirmed what Méchain had perhaps suspected but could not accept. The error was almost certainly due to atmospheric refraction. It was not Méchain's fault. It was not a flaw in his technique or his instruments. It was a systematic effect of measuring near sea level, one that no one had fully accounted for at the time, and one that did not meaningfully affect the final value of the meter. The meter was fine. The measurement was good. Méchain's 14 years of torment were, in a deep and terrible sense, unnecessary. There is something in Méchain's story that goes beyond the history of science. It is a story about the cost of perfectionism, about the way the pursuit of an impossible standard can hollow out a life. Science is built on error. It advances not in spite of mistakes, but through them, through the honest acknowledgement of what we got wrong, the careful analysis of why, and the gradual refinement that follows. Méchain knew this intellectually, but he could not live it. He could not be the kind of scientist who reports an anomaly and moves on. He could only be the kind who cannot rest until the anomaly is resolved, and when it would not resolve, could not rest at all. We think of the great scientists as people of superhuman precision and certainty, but the more honest truth is that they were people who worked in conditions of profound uncertainty, with imperfect instruments, in imperfect conditions, and produced results that were good enough, not perfect, never perfect, but good enough to build on. The meter was good enough. The kilogram was good enough. The measurement of the earth was good enough. And it was built on the work of a man who could not, in his own heart, believe that good enough was good enough. Rest gently, Méchain. The meter stands. The metric system spreads, slowly. Then all at once, Napoleon did not love the metric system. Or rather, He loved it in the abstract and found it inconvenient in practice, which is a fair summary of his relationship with many Enlightenment ideals. But even Napoleon, who introduced the mesures usuals and walked back some of the revolution's most radical measurement reforms, did something inadvertent and enormous for the metric system. He conquered most of Europe wherever Napoleon's armies went. French administrative systems followed, legal codes, educational institutions, governmental structures, and, often, the metric system. In the German states, French-influenced governments introduced metric measurement as part of a broader modernization project. The Napoleonic Wars were, among many other things, a forced experiment in European administrative standardization. And when the wars ended, when Napoleon was exiled and the old dynasties crept back to their thrones, a curious thing happened. Many of the administrative reforms that his empire had brought stayed in place. Not everywhere, and not without modification, but enough to have seeded the metric idea across a large portion of the continent, in France itself. The mesures usuals that Napoleon had introduced were finally abolished in 1840. By then, a full generation had grown up in the post-revolutionary educational system, where the metric units were standard. The old names, the pied, the toys, the lever, were fading from daily speech, at least in the cities. The resistance that had seemed so immovable in 1800 had thinned, year by year, as the people who remembered the old system were replaced by people who had never known anything else. The meter was becoming normal, which is to say, it was becoming invisible, which is the ultimate fate of any successful standard. The scientific community had adopted metric units much faster than the general public. By the early 19th century, scientists across Europe were using metric measurement in their work, not because they were French, or because they admired the French Revolution, but because it was genuinely better. Decimal-based units were infinitely easier to work with in calculation. Converting between grams and kilograms, between centimeters and meters, required nothing more than moving a decimal point. The old systems, with their arbitrary conversion factors, 12 inches in a foot, 16 ounces in a pound, 5,280 feet in a mile, were a constant low-level tax on mathematical work. The metric system, once you learned it, felt like removing that tax, like thinking in a language that had finally been freed of unnecessary complication. The spread of science was, in this sense, the spread of the metric system. As scientific cooperation became more international, as journals began to circulate across borders, as researchers corresponded and collaborated in ways that the 18th century had only begun to imagine, the need for a shared standard became more acute. You cannot have an international scientific community that uses different units for the same things. Or rather, you can, but it is a constant, tedious source of error and miscommunication. The metric system was the obvious solution, and scientists adopted it, country by country. Through the middle of the 19th century, in 1875, something formal happened. The meter convention, the Convention du Meter, was signed in Paris by 17 countries. It established the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, headquartered near Paris at Sèvres, and created a framework for international coordination of standards. New standard meter bars and kilogram weights were made, this time in an alloy of platinum and iridium, harder and more stable than the original platinum standards. Copies were distributed to member states. A system of regular international comparison was established, so that the standards could be checked against each other, and any drift could be detected and corrected. This was the metric system becoming institutional. Not just a French invention, not just a revolutionary ideal, but an international infrastructure, a shared commitment among nations to measure the same things the same way. Over the following decades, more countries signed. The scientific community was essentially universal by the end of the 19th century. Commercial adoption followed, unevenly, but progressively. There is a country that stands out in this story, though a country that had been present at the very beginning of the metric dream and had, over the course of 2 centuries, found reason after reason to hold back: the United States. Jefferson had been interested in measurement reform in 1790, and there had been a brief, genuine possibility that the new American Republic would adopt a rational decimal system from the start. It didn't happen. The connection to British units, familiar, embedded in commerce and law and daily life, proved too strong. And then a kind of path dependency set in. The longer the United States waited to metricate, the larger the cost of switching, and the harder it became to justify. There were efforts. The Metric Act of 1866 made it legal to use metric units in the United States, a modest step. In 1975, the Metric Conversion Act called for voluntary conversion, and there was a genuine national effort for several years. Road signs were posted in kilometers. Weather reports offered Celsius temperatures. Manufacturers began labeling products in both systems. Then the effort stalled. The public resisted, more or less exactly as the French public had resisted 2 centuries earlier, through the simple power of the familiar. The unwillingness to relearn what you already know. The feeling that your own measurements are part of your culture, and no committee in Washington has the right to take them away. The United States today officially uses the metric system for science, medicine, and much of industry, but daily life, road signs, body weight, cooking, weather remains stubbornly imperial. It is a vivid illustration of something the French discovered in the 1790s. You cannot standardize your way into people's hearts. You can define the meter perfectly. You can mandate its use by law. You can produce the most rational, beautiful, universally applicable system of measurement in the history of human civilization. And people will still ask for a pound of butter, and yet the meter had one more secret to give up. One that the original surveyors could never have imagined. The meter was about to leave the earth entirely. What is a meter, really? The final, extraordinary answer. We have come a long way from the Paris market of 1785, from the merchant with her linen and her contested own. We have followed the dream of the philosophers, the chaos of the revolution. The extraordinary journey of 2 men across a broken country to measure the earth. We have watched the metric system fail and recover, and slowly, stubbornly spread across most of the world. And now, at the end of our journey, there is one more extraordinary thing to tell. In 1983, the meter was redefined, not changed. The length stayed essentially the same, but the definition changed. And the new definition is so beautiful, so strange, so far beyond anything the Revolutionary Committee could have imagined, that it deserves to be sat with for a moment. The original meter was defined as 1/10,000,000th of the Earth's meridian arc, from the North Pole to the equator, a fraction of the planet, tied to the world we live on. It was a lovely definition, grounded, physical, something you could imagine walking. The earth is the earth. It will always be the same size. Your meter will always mean the same thing, except as science advanced and measurement became ever more precise, problems began to emerge. The earth is not a perfect sphere. Its diameter varies slightly between the poles and the equator. The meridian length itself is not perfectly constant tectonic activity. The slow creep of continents, the subtle deformation of the planet's crust over geological time, means that the Earth is not the perfectly stable reference object it appeared to be in 1791, so the definition was refined over time. And then in 1983, it was transformed entirely. The meter is now defined as the distance light travels in a vacuum in exactly 1/299th, 792,458 of a second. Let that sit for a moment. The meter, the unit derived from the size of the Earth, defined by two men walking through a revolution with theodolites and dreams, is now defined in terms of the speed of light. This is remarkable for several reasons. The speed of light in a vacuum is one of the most fundamental constants in the universe. It does not vary. It is the same everywhere in the cosmos, not just everywhere on Earth, but everywhere, full stop. It is the same in a laboratory in Paris as in a laboratory in Beijing, and it would be the same in a laboratory on the far side of the Milky Way if one existed. Light travels at approximately 299,792,458 meters per second, and we have simply inverted that relationship. A meter is the length that light travels. In 1/299th, 792,458 of a second. The meter is now cosmic. It is no longer tied to the Earth. It is tied to the universe. The Enlightenment philosophers wanted a measure that belonged to nature, not to kings. They got one. They could not have imagined how vast nature was going to turn out to be. Think about what the original committee was imagining when they proposed to base the meter on the Earth's meridian. They were thinking about nature as something large and stable and graspable, the planet we live on, the ground beneath our feet, something that exists beyond human power and therefore cannot be manipulated by it. That was their criterion for a truly universal measure: independence from human authority. A measurement that is true because it is natural, not because any king or government decreed it so, and they were right in their instinct. Even if the specific object they chose, the Earth, turns out not to be stable enough for the precision that modern science requires. The instinct was right. Tie your measures to something that exists beyond human power, something that cannot be changed by decree or custom, or the whims of whoever happens to be in charge. The meter they defined was a step toward. The meter as it exists today is the fulfillment of it. Light is not a French invention. Light does not care about the French Revolution or Napoleon, or whether you prefer inches to centimeters. Light travels at the same speed regardless of who is asking or when or where in the universe they happen to be standing. The kilogram, for centuries, had its own remarkable story. Until 2019, the kilogram was defined by a physical object, a cylinder of platinum-rhodium alloy, made in 1889 and kept in a vault at the International Bureau of Weights and Measures in the international prototype kilogram. For 130 years, every other kilogram in the world was defined by comparison to this one object. If the prototype drifted, if the surface picked up a few molecules of contamination, or lost them in cleaning, then every scale in the world would technically have changed by a minuscule amount. Without anyone knowing, periodic comparisons between the prototype and its official copies showed small but measurable differences accumulating over time. Nobody could say for certain whether the prototype was gaining mass or losing it, whether the copies were drifting or the original was. The uncertainty was tiny. We are talking about micrograms, millionths of a gram, but it was real. The foundation of the world's mass measurement was a single object in a vault, and nobody could be fully certain what it weighed in 2019. The kilogram was redefined in terms of Planck's constant, a fundamental quantity in quantum mechanics, as unchanging as the speed of light. The cylinder in the vault is no longer the definition of the kilogram. It is a historical artifact, a physical record of 130 years of careful measurement. The kilogram, like the meter, is now cosmic. It is defined not by any object on Earth, but by a fundamental constant of the universe. The original philosophers would have been delighted, and perhaps a little bit stunned, what this means, stepping back and taking the long view. Is that the story of the metric system? Is a story about something we might not have expected when we began. It is a story about the progressive expansion of our idea of nature. In 1791, nature was the earth, the ground, the sky, the mountains and seas. The meter was a fraction of the planet's circumference. In 1983, nature was the universe, the constant speed of light, the same everywhere light has ever traveled. Today, the kilogram is defined by Planck's constant, one of the deepest regularities in the fabric of reality. Each step in this expansion was a step toward the philosopher's dream, a unit that belongs to nobody and everybody, a unit as permanent as the laws of physics. And here we are, near the end of our night together. You have traveled through a marketplace in 1785, smelling bread and rain on cobblestones, holding a bolt of linen and arguing about what an own means. You have sat in candlelit studies with men who dreamed of a better world and believed, with the wonderful stubborn faith of the Enlightenment, that reason could get you there. You have walked across a revolutionary France with two astronomers and their instruments, through arrests and accidents and the private torture of an unresolved discrepancy. You have stood in village markets with the ordinary people who refused, for decades, to let go of the measurements their grandparents used. You have watched the metric system fail and survive and spread, and finally transform into something the original dreamers could not have imagined. What remains at the end of all this is something simple, something human, the desire to measure, to count and weigh and compare, to know how far, how much, how heavy, how long. It is one of the oldest things about us. Before writing, before cities, before civilization in any formal sense, human beings were measuring with their bodies, with stones, with lengths of rope and notched sticks, and the careful observation of shadows. Measurement is how we navigate the world. It is how we share knowledge, and conduct trade, and build things that last, and communicate across the distances of language and culture and time. The metric system, for all the drama and difficulty and human cost of its creation, is an attempt to do that sharing as fairly and as accurately as possible, to give every person on Earth the market woman and the scientist, and the farmer and the child, learning mathematics, the same tools, the same language of quantity, one system for everyone, derived not from the accident of history or the authority of kings, but from the unchanging laws of nature itself. The Enlightenment philosophers wanted a measure that belonged to the whole world. They got one. It just took a revolution, 2 stubborn astronomers, decades of resistance, and a definition that reaches from the corner market stall all the way to the speed of light. When you think about it, a rather extraordinary thing to have built. Sleep well. The meter will be here in the morning, as long as light still travels. And with that, I hope your world feels a little more measured tonight. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next episode.
And so we come to the end of tonight's story. Thank you truly for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Leave a like if this helped you relax, and share it with anyone who might need a peaceful night's rest. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of Genghis Khan's story stayed with you the most? What would you like to explore in future episodes? Your voice matters here. Now, let go of the day. Let go of everything that doesn't serve you in this moment. The step is quiet, the wind is soft, and sleep is waiting for you, gentle and warm. Good night, dear listener. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next story.